I have just a little bit of business to get through before we begin our talk this evening. The Carter is deeply grateful to Finis Welch for this generous bequest, and to Laura Anderson and Kevin Murphy for facilitating the transfer of Welch's remarkable art holdings to the museum. We are also thankful for his family, and particularly his daughters, Marcy and Melissa, for their gracious understanding and support of this gift. Filled with masterpiece works, Welch's collection strengthens the Carter's ability to tell the story of American modernism. It is an important gift that boosts the museum's stature as an internationally renowned repository of photography. Additionally, we would like to thank the TCC Sign Language Program for their partnership with the Carter. Yay! These intern students and faculty will be an ongoing presence at talks and other public programs here at the museum, and I am thrilled that the two of you are here today. But tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers. Joining us in conversation this evening is the Carter's Senior Curator of Photographs, John Rohrbach, and our guest tonight, Diana Edkins, who has been active in the fine art photography world since 1969. Over the course of her eclectic career as a curator, archivist, editor, author, photographer, historian, and advisor, she has published over 28 books, the first of which, titled William Henry Jackson, was written with her mentor, Beaumont Newhall. It accompanied the retrospective exhibition of Jackson's work, which was held here at the Carter from September 6th through October 20th in 1974. She is known for her discerning eye and deep knowledge of fine art photography. Along with Newhall, Edkins has worked closely with John Tchaikovsky, Alexander Lieberman, and Irving Penn, just to name a few. She was the first curator at Condé Nast Photography Archive, where she remained for 20 years. From 2002 to May 2009, she held the position of Director of Exhibition and Limited Edition Photographs at Aperture, where she produced, organized, and curated over 40 exhibitions, including such shows as Stephen Shore, a biographical landscape, Chuck Close, A Couple of Ways of Doing Something, and Lisette Modell and her successors, co-curated with Larry Fink. Edkins is a consultant to photography institutions, collectors, and artists. After John and Diana's conversation this evening, we will transition into Q&A with all of you. I will have a microphone that we'll be able to pass around, and this is primarily because we are recording tonight's talk, and we'll be posting this on our YouTube channel in a few weeks. So we want to make sure your questions will be heard on the recording. And with that, please join me in welcoming John and Diana.
Thank you. First, I'd like to welcome you all here. I heard it was a nice day outside. I got here at, I guess, about 7:30, 7:45. It was still a little cool, and haven't been outside, but I should have gone outside because these wonderful spring days seem to be few and far between. I hope those of you who stay over tonight have longer distance drives or travel are able to get home. It sounds like we're getting stock show weather tomorrow. And at least I've heard that it's not going to be down in the mid-20s as they predicted earlier this week. And as we all know, those of us who live in Texas, in this area in particular, know that what they predict today may well not occur tomorrow. Today, I want to thank, basically second Madeline's comments about Finis Welch, his family, and what he's done for this institution. But less than his bequest, it's his friendship that is really dear to me. I only knew him for 11 years, the last 11 years of his life. There was much that I didn't know, much that I learned through those 11 years. And I miss him tremendously. He died in August or September 2020. And I'm still living with him every day. The collection that he so generously and kindly bequested to the museum, just for those of you who don't know, extended to about 220 photographs that extend in the time period from about 1900 to works done in the last few years. Supplementing that are 30 works on paper, largely lithographs, by a whole tier of important artists. So in both cases, the collection is really remarkable and one of the major gifts that this institution has gotten through its lifetime. But I want to step back because you all came today because of, in many ways, the name Finis Welch and his bequest of photography. Tonight there's a little bit of false advertising in two different ways. One is, and now I have you as a captive audience, so I can tell you this. One is that we won't really as much have a conversation as I had thought initially. So when I have to pull these together 2 years in advance, you have to realize this. And so I'll talk a little bit about how Finis came into my life and my orbit, and how I reached a point where I had to turn to Diana and say, help me. The second thing is, while Finis is in the background to all of this, tonight is really about collecting, and it's about what curators, one of the key things that curators do as part of their jobs. And by that I mean that if I had to describe my job to my neighbor, and one of my neighbors I still, after decades, can't get to come to the museum. Sorry to say that. If I had to describe my job, I'd say, one, I'm a supreme photo nerd. Anything dealing with photographs.
I'll second that.
Of yours and mine. All your baby pictures, vacation pictures, I just eat it all up. But with that comes, for me, a certain responsibility to myself and to those people around me. And it starts with myself, in that if I have images, I have 50 images sitting in front of me, some I'll like more than others. And if I'm trying to figure out, I can put them in order or so on. But if I'm trying to figure out why, I start to explain to myself. And if I can verbalize it, then I can start to explain it to others. And that kind of discrimination feeds back into all aspects of my job. So part of it is looking. The second part is relating that information, and it's related through conversation, it's related through exhibition, it's related through catalogs, and so on and so forth. And tied to that is, if you're working at a museum, one of the great joys of a curator who works at an institution like this is adding to what came before, meaning helping build a collection that is ever more diverse and ever more interesting for those that come after me. Of course, on some level, it has to be interesting to me, but on another level, I'm building on what my predecessors provided, and they set certain pathways that I have to choose whether to continue to go down, supplement, or go in another direction. A collector does, in some ways, the same thing. They look hard, they discriminate. If you're an astute collector, you can start to explain on some level, some are more verbal than others, why they like certain things more than others. And they build a collection that has some coherence to it. And Finis was an unusual case because this is really a tale of his learning to do that. Um, Let me start with a picture of the gentleman. And I have a hard time looking at it because it brings back so many memories. So luckily I'm facing all of you. But all of this started in an odd way. It started with an email that came not to me, but to our marketing department. And it was an email that Finis wrote saying, I have a bunch of photographs. I'm starting to get too many photographs on my wall, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with it all. And do you ever take loan of a photograph? And the email went on to explain, it mentioned the name Edward Weston, and I had heard of Edward Weston. It mentioned the name, I have a few Ansel Adams photographs. I had heard of Ansel Adams. And it mentioned, and I'd never heard of Finis Welch. It came out of the blue. It mentioned another photographer whose name shall not pass my lips tonight for reasons that I'll get into, who he said, there's another print of this by this photographer, and this is the print that I want you all to show, put on display. And that print was shown at the Getty Museum. And of course, as a photographer, these names and this idea are intriguing. And I say, okay, but I've got to look at the print first. And that's the funny thing about photography. We all have what we are silly to still call phones. They're really cameras. And we all make pictures, and it's very easy to make pictures, and many of us put them up online and put albums in the old since they're all gone and so on. But that difference between looking and envisioning the world in an artful way is a pretty major difference. Then, the difference between making one print and making 5 prints, in the days that Diana and I got into all of this trade, every print would be different. It's less so today. But what it means is that while photography is a medium of copies, through much of photo history, every copy is slightly different. And there are better ones and worse ones. And I could walk you through the show, and someday perhaps we'll be lucky to be able to do that, where I can start to point out those nuances that make the difference between an image of what you see, whether it be a nude or a landscape or whatever, and another image of the same scene that has a totally different, much more poetic character to it. And when Finis approached me with this print, he said, I come to Fort Worth periodically. I'll just come by and bring the print. And he came by and brought the print, and I looked at it, and I said, no, I don't want to show it. It's not good enough. Now, don't laugh at me.
Brazen.
And I said, it's an interesting image, it's an important image, but the print isn't good enough, and that goes back to those kinds of issues of connoisseurship. Well, he had spent a lot of money on this image, and he was embarrassed. But Finis was a really bright guy, and he took it as a challenge. Now, between the time the email came in and we had made arrangements for him to come up and my meeting him for the first time, I took advantage of the internet. And I said, who the heck is this Finis Welch? Maybe he's listed somewhere. And I found all these Finis Welches around the world. I found a Finis Welch who was a teacher at various universities at various times. I found a Finis Welch that had started and run something called Welch Consulting, which was an agency that provided consulting dealing with labor issues, employment issues, and so on and so forth. And then I found this Finis Welch that seemed to have co-started a company called Staticorp, which produced a major statistical software package. that I'd heard of, actually, because my brother is an economist and uses statistics. And then I found there's this Finis Welch that is somehow connected to a ranch in Centerville, Texas. And I said, are these all the same person, or are these all different people, or where do all of these things overlap? Here now, added to that, I've got this Finis Welch who thinks he's a collector. And only during our 11 years of friendship, and I call it friendship in the deepest sense of the word, did I learn how smart he was, how driven he was, how kind he was, and how much he was teaching himself to be a collector. And let me tell you what I mean by that. And I'm going to ask you to keep track of time so that we make sure we give you some time to talk.
You can talk as long as you want, because then I can shorten mine.
After, what Finis did was, when I turned him down, he took it as a challenge. And he said, why? Obvious question for some, but other people would just turn away in embarrassment or in anger or whatever. He, to his credit, he said why. And we started a conversation about photography, about the market, what the market is, and so on and so forth. And he invited me, over the course of those early conversations, to come visit his offices to see some of the other works in his collection. And this piece by Horace Bristol is part of a portfolio that was one of the items decorating an office that he had in Washington, D.C. Remember, he's the economist who's running Welch Consulting. He's got an office in Washington. He's got an office in the West Coast, and so on. And I went to Washington, and he wasn't there, but his staff graciously let me in, and I saw this image. And it's an interesting image. It takes you straight back to, obviously, the Grapes of Wrath. And Horace Bristol, I learned as I looked it up on the internet, like all of you would, had approached Life magazine in 1937 and pitched an idea of going out to California and photographing people who had left the Midwest, left Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle, and gone out to California. And I haven't learned, because I haven't delved into it deeply enough, obviously, how he connected up with John Steinbeck, but the two of them went out to California together. And Bristol made his photographs, Steinbeck made notes, and then they took the article back to Life, and Life turned him down. Said, no, we're not going to do the article. For one reason or another, Life is this cipher. Maybe you can explain what goes on behind the doors of Life. But what happened is Steinbeck said, okay, I'm going to take my notes and the ideas that Bristol had through his images, and I'm going to create The Grapes of Wrath, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1949, became a major John Ford film in 1940. And when John Ford and those around him went to cast that film, they went back to Horace Bristol's images for ideas about those people who they should approach for the film and how they would dress the people in the film. Now, all of that is really interesting detail about this, but these prints were made, and I'm sorry, I have the date wrong. I have errors in my system. The portfolio was made in 1989 as a fundraiser for a theatrical version of The Grapes of Wrath that was being presented at La Jolla Theater in California. The portfolio was never fully finished, but the prints were made. A box was made for the portfolio, and the box made it into Finis's hands. He bought it and put them up on his walls. Now, for me, as a curator of an institution at this level, I'd rather have 1938 prints or 1940 prints by Horace Bristol rather than late prints that were made by somebody else in a quick form. So I said, once again, Finis, they're really nice. They look great on the wall. They're not really for us. But keep at it. You have an interest in photography, so keep at it. A couple of months later, I go to his house, and this is the first thing I see. In the entryways in the first rooms of his house are filled with this very colorful, large lithographs by second-generation abstract expressionist artists. This is a piece by Sam Francis. I don't know if you can see behind me the date and so on. It was made very much at the end of his life. And in these, you're not surprised on some level that these are the kinds of things that decorate the walls. They're large, they're colorful, they fill the walls, and they entertained him. But I also saw images like these. Weston, Adams, remember where we started? But again, the prints that I saw were, I don't know if you can see it behind me because I'm in the way of your life here. But the Weston print was, it says printed by Cole Weston, I think. I'm going to have
Yes,
to turn
it
around
does.
and see to
Yeah.
make sure I put the information in. And the difference between what I told Finis when I saw them, and there are probably 5 or 6 of these images, was if I brought a print by Edward of this same image, Edward made the negative, and put it up to next to your Cole print, you'd see a major difference between the two. And you'd immediately, this is heresy, I shouldn't say this, you'd probably let go of, I'll put it that way, you'd probably let go of your Cole prints and be collecting Edward's work. And he looked at me a little quizzically, but he said, okay. And I said the same thing with the Ansel Adams prints. These were small 11 by 14 prints. And I asked him about where he got them and how he got them. And he said, well, they were good deals. These were major artists, and they weren't very expensive, and they seemed like good deals. Perfect thing for an economist to say. But I also saw when I walked around the house a few more sort of unusual things. A portfolio of color works by a gentleman named William Eggleston, who some of you may know brought about museum acceptance of art in color in photography, and that's a whole nother long story, which is again for another time. And Paul Atterbridge, one of the early adherents to color photography. In 1937, when this print was made, if you were going to make that print, you often had to have a camera that made not 1, but 3 different exposures, and it had mirrors inside. And you had to then separate the colors out of what you started with and then put them back together by hand. So this is actually a layering of 3 different colors of information, all in very clear, close registration, all done by hand. So it's a very involved process to make one print like that. You can see that print upstairs. Would have taken him about 12 hours. And it's work he couldn't have done in the Texas summer because it's too dry. You have to have a certain amount of humidity and so on and so forth. So I said, oh, there's some interesting things. He's been collecting some interesting things here. And then I saw this Robert Heineken photograph from the early 1970s. And it started to become even more interesting because Heineken was a major teacher out at UCLA on the West Coast. His, shall we say, sexual politics would be very suspect today. But he was a major influence on a wide range of photographers. And then I started to see not quite images like this, but we started talking about images like this. And I invited Finis back up to Fort Worth, and I pulled things out of our collection, and I said, this is what I mean in terms of fine art prints. And he caught the bug. In the meantime, and this is my ulterior motive of having you all as a captive audience here, if I can convince one of you to become a photo collector and collect work that is at the level of a museum, and particularly if it's American work, it becomes interesting to me, and I'm happy. I'm a resource. I'm happy to help you out. I'm happy to teach you. I'm happy to advise you, and so on and so forth, which is what I told Finis. And Finis caught the bug. I sent him, we have a collection support group. I sent him the membership forms. I had to cajole him for about 10 or 12 months to get him to join. Finally, he joined. He took a trip out to Los Angeles because he had an office out in Los Angeles and he had an apartment out there, so it was easy for him to come. We went to a photo fair, and we walk around the photo fair, and there wasn't that much of interest to me, probably because I had seen much of the work at the photo fair, but Finis went off on his own, and he found the Ansel Adams table. And he looked at the work there, and he asked the price. And the dealer said, $160. And Finis said, wow. And this is a large Ansel Adams print. He said, $160 for a big Ansel Adams print. That's great. And he continued to talk with the dealer, and it was only over a period of conversation that he realized something must be wrong with this picture. And only over a period of time did he realize that the dealer was saying 160, meaning $160,000. So again, that's another part of Finis's learning about photography. He had connected in with a dealer on the West Coast that was feeding him more outer bridges. Remember the color outer bridge that I saw before? This is not a talk about photo history. This is a talk about learning about photography and learning about collecting. He started buying small or other pieces by outer bridge, and all this is a picture of one of those early detachable collars that people used to wear early in the century. But it's so graphically interesting that it's, for at least me, I can't speak for all of you, hard to keep your eye off it because it's really fascinating. And then he also he worked with another dealer totally on his own and bought this image along with a few others. These are night shots of the desert. Where the prints, you can see there's a brown tone to it and sort of a grayish tone. They're what are called split tone. It's a special processing mechanism to give the prints this sort of unusual character and color. And the photographer, Richard Mistrak, had merely gone out with his car, put his headlights on these cactuses and made these images. But if you look at the actual print, the dark areas really start to have a luminous character to them. And when he told me he bought this, that was really interesting to me because we had just bought a couple of others of these. And we conversed a little bit more about his interest in loaning work to the museum, and what we ended up doing, and Andrew will remember this, is we put our print up against this print and put them up in the galleries. So the conversation is moving along.
Oh, wait a minute, before you move. This eyed collar appeared in Vanity Fair. I put together a collection of Vanity Fair photographs, and when it first appeared, Marcel Duchamp cut it out and put it up on a wall because he felt that it was really where art was going. Now, Finis didn't know that, but he began to get intuitively an understanding of what a masterpiece was and what spoke to him.
He still had a lot to learn, but he had a good eye, clearly. He also went back to Ansel Adams. He started buying larger prints. We had bought Clearing Winter Storm, which you see behind us, so he bought Clearing Winter Storm. It's good enough for the museum, I must get another one. and I turned to him when he mentioned that to me, and I said, no. What you need to do is buy those Ansel Adams prints that we don't have, and then donate to us.
However, he put those Ansel Adams in his bedroom.
He did.
And he surrounded himself with them, that he could see them every day. So he really loved them. So he didn't just do it for the museum.
And this one, no, he's really collecting for himself. I have my motives, he has his motives.
Exactly.
And so this other Ansel Adams, I don't know if you could see the size. It's huge. It's 65 by 45 inches. And the scene is well known, but most of us, if you know the scene from other Ansel Adams prints, it's always presented as a horizontal. And this is Adams' own unusual cropping. He makes what was then called a mural print. 65 by 45 inches was huge, even in 1980s. Now it's relatively small in today's world, but at that point it was really huge. So he was starting to really get some momentum and starting to buy some pretty major things. And then he went to auction, and he bought this Horst piece and the Eugene Smith piece totally on his own.
Well, I helped him with the Horst.
See, I tell you lies. Don't believe what you say.
No, I helped him with the Horst because this print, this image comes up a lot.
It does.
And yet this was the most beautiful print that I had seen for many, many times. So I encouraged him to get this. And again, like the eyed collar, this was done when Horst, who had been in France working for French Vogue and American Vogue in France, this was the last picture he took before he left Europe. And so this was very, very important to him because it was closing a major portion of his photographic life, therefore the corset.
So obviously, since I've been telling you lies, I have to stop talking. And it's a great transition because this is a symbol of the fact that Finis was so into collecting at this point. Finis never did anything halfway, whether it be ranching, whether it be his economics work, whether it be helping out disadvantaged students and so on and so forth. He never did anything halfway. And I was getting emails and calls every week. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? Would you go up to New York to see this? And so on and so forth. And I just threw up my hands and I could quit my job and I could just do this. But my heart lies with collection building, and I was perfectly happy here. Hear that, Andrew? And I needed help, so I turned to Diana, who I didn't know well, but we had crossed paths at different times through the photo world. And I knew she had a tremendous amount of experience and expertise that she could bring to this kind of project to help a collector shape a collection. And so I'm going to let Diana tell that story. Thank you.
So John called me and said, well, you should meet this man, Finis Welch. And my daughter lives in D.C., and so I went down to D.C., and we met in the lobby of a hotel. And we had a conversation. I can't not remember what we said to each other. And I left. I went back to my daughter's apartment, and she said, well, how did it go? And I said, well, I'll never hear from him again. But I didn't think it went very well. But that was Finis. Finis had to think about it. You know, he had to digest. And I have a little prepared speech. Unlike John, I don't talk as well extemporaneously. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, read a little bit. I call this from the literal to the visceral. And that's really how I think from the Horace Bristol to the last picture you'll see in this presentation, which is completely visceral and abstract and completely Finis. Sometimes artworks take such an intense hold on us that we cannot stop thinking about them over and over again. And that sort of became the rule that we both had for when we acquired something. Photography is a system of seeing, editing, clarity of idea, process, and elegance of execution. And I think that became the fulcrum of his looking at work and then acquiring work. At its best, it's revelatory, both as revelation and something to revel in. As John said in one of the labels upstairs, and you really should go and see the show because it is very moving and it really shows the democracy of Finis's ability to see and collect. John said, Finis is a romantic, yet one with a healthy irreverence for convention. Finis did not collect for investment or for social standing, but for his own aesthetic pleasure. He had an independent mind, he was a fierce intellect, and he was a lover of beauty, a beauty of everything. I was telling Andrew before, when I went down to his ranch, he wanted me to see all of his places where he lived because he lived with art everywhere. And that became very important to him for me to know. And I looked out of his living room at the ranch, and there was this, I'm a gardener as well, and he loved gardening. And there was this incredible composition of great myrtles, all in bloom when I was there, and different colors, and the symmetry and the way it sat in the landscape is how I see that he saw his collection as well. He strove to be the best at everything. Therefore, he began to seek out masterpieces, as John was saying, not only iconic images, but also ones of the highest quality. We would wait until the best possible print, like that corset picture, would be available. His collection was driven by personal taste. His breadth of knowledge, willingness to listen, willingness to listen. Each image had to be a unique statement and the finest quality. The follow-through is what counted. As invested in realism as he was, he recognized subtle beauty and the medium which it had to offer. He lived with his collection. Photographs filled each room, carefully placed. It was about surrounding himself with life and with beauty. Enigmas attracted him. As we continued working together, few words were actually exchanged. We both focused on quality and how a work spoke to him rather than trends. What each piece had in common was absolute fidelity to the medium.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Sorry. One of the interesting things that struck me in my early dealings with him is that both of us would try to give him books and say, learn the history, and here's something you might look at and read. And at least for photography, I didn't know Finis well enough in the other segments of his life, but within photography, he wasn't really a reader of the photo histories and the photo books.
But he looked at them.
He looked at them, but he worked, as you suggest, a little more intuitively.
Yes.
So the history, filling in every little gap of the history wasn't as important for him.
No, the picture had to speak to him personally. It had to be either emotive or speak to what he knew about his own life. A lot of his work, a lot of his collection is a reflection of his own life.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I could then go on for another 20 minutes. He grew up outside of Houston. He was the last of 8 or so children, to a father who was a farmer, a mother who was an elementary school teacher. He grew up very much in straitened circumstances during the Depression era. He grew up within the farming community. He joined 4-H. He joined Future Farmers of America. He raised chickens and turkeys and sheep and so on, sold turkeys through the neighborhood, had a paper route, and so on and so forth.
But those were adventures for him. You know, he didn't see them necessarily as work. He saw them as stepping stones.
But they also provided, in a way, his sort of grounding for being interested in the Depression, interested in people's economic well-being. And you see it in the Horace Bristol images and other images upstairs. His interests were so diverse that you also see that upstairs. You see landscape, you see nudes, you see experimental photography, you see Depression-era photography.
Well, one of the groups of pictures that are not here are the 2 Dorothea Langes, William Burrows and the family. and they're beautifully coupled, one above the other. And they came up on auction. He called me and he said, "We need to get this. Go look at them, see if they're okay." And they had to be the most beautiful print, the most beautiful print. And so I went and I looked. And it was very interesting when I was at auction. He either let me bid, or he was on the phone and he followed me, or then in certain pieces he wanted to take over. So it was, we really worked hand in hand, which was such a pleasure.
Yeah, for me it was hard because I'm used to determining myself whether something looks good, and to put my trust in somebody else's eyes for that kind of nuance is really hard. But you did okay.
Sometimes. Anyway, let's go to Todd. So we knew that he liked nudes. He was interested in nude photography. And I had appraised the collection of Todd Walker's work. I went out to Arizona and went through thousands of color types and sabatiers and things like that. And so I thought, oh, he likes nudes. Why doesn't he try to get some of these? So he asked both of us to go out, and you can take it from here.
Oh, I had to go out because I didn't quite trust Diana's eye yet. And we went out and we chose nudes together. And it was in some ways an experiment. We were working with Todd Walker's daughter. So it was fun to meet her, fun to see a range of images. We're sort of testing the waters. I saw other nudes at Finis's house. So I knew he liked nudes, and this was to say, well, here's some other ones that you might like and might be good fits in the collection, if that's one component of your collection that you really want to build. I should also admit that I'm not a personal fan of nudes. That's my own problem and issue. I love my wife dearly, but it's not something that is, I find as engaging as other forms of photography. So it was a challenge for me, and I got great guidance from Diana as we both sort of made a selection of images for Finis.
And yet, this one, I'm particularly happy about this one, 5 Women, because it was the piece that the sisters did not want to get rid of.
That's the best one of the lot. It's for me, the most interesting one.
And so we really had to work on them for quite a long time. And Finis was okay with it, and then we got it.
Yep. So, do you want the next slide?
Yes, please. You can talk to this because...
Now for something completely different. The image on the you're right, the Paul Strand image comes from my background. Anytime you're building a collection, you're collecting also from your own interests and your own background. A curator and a museum are gatekeepers, and they go by the strengths and weaknesses of their curatorial staff and the interests of their curatorial staff. So I have to admit I haven't built up the collection of nudes, but I spent an early part of my career running an archive of Paul Strand's photographs. Paul Strand was a major 20th century American photographer, based largely in New York, but after 1950 in Europe, in part because of the Red Scare. And I sort of cut my teeth in terms of connoisseurship, learning what could be done in terms of beautiful prints with Strand. And I watched the prices go up during the time that I was working with the archive. And then they've settled back down. It's one of those odd things about the market. Photography is a tough thing to buy. If you buy a painting, you know it's just one thing. If you buy prints, generally the prices are fairly modest, although today printmakers are making smaller and smaller editions to try to overcome that. Photography pricing can be all over the place, and it can change dramatically, and you just have to be aware of it. But I have to admit, I convinced Finis to buy the Strand because I thought it was an incredible print. Images like this don't come on market very often, and it was at a modest price. He accepted my recommendations, bought the work, and then put it in a box. So I learned my lesson. It's this learning of what somebody likes and what they don't like and what will work for them. The Steichen was another piece bought at auction, which I particularly liked, but I think Finis liked. It's a work that he bought and put up on the wall. And if you go upstairs, you'll see 3 portraits of women on the east wall at the early stages of the exhibition that I encourage you to look at each one of them in turn because they're so different from each other. And this one, the photographer made the year he got married to this woman. So he was deeply in love. I love her sort of demure kind of look out from underneath, peeking out from underneath her hat. And it just has a really sort of sweet character to it, loving character to it.
Next. This, to me, is one of the crowning jewels of his collection. And he had it here in Fort Worth. And it was the photograph. I mean, what's so interesting is here you have a flag in a plastic bag on a wall. Who would photograph that? I mean, you wouldn't. Yet Mitch did, and Mitch did for the reasons of talking about how we look at things and how we understand things and underlying irony and hermetically sealed things. And I think, again, Finis, I was not responsible for that. I mean, I think it came out of your show. However, we never had to talk about it. You know, we both understood that it really represented something radically different in photography and yet stood on its own.
Yeah, to give you a quick sort of photo historical background, Mitch Epstein, you may remember, we had the show just last year of his landscapes. This is the same photographer earlier in his career. It comes from a whole series about his family and particularly about his relationship with his father, who had died, and the family was getting together. His father ran a furniture store in central Massachusetts. And the family was getting together to collect all of the material of the household in the furniture store and put it away and decide, give it away, sell it, decide what to do about it. So it's an image that his father always had a flag out in front of the furniture store. And as part of closing up the shop, they took the flag to the dry cleaner. And Mitch, as part of that whole process of going through his family effects, documented it, recorded interviews with his family members about what they thought about the father, how they lived with the father, and the whole notion of the family business. In particular, this was an image that was in a show about the history of color photography in the United States. Color didn't come to acceptance in the United States until quite late in its technical history. So it's about why it wasn't accepted for so long and then what made it be accepted. And this was just one of the many images in the show, and Finis took a deep love to it and decided he wanted it.
Because it also was a private moment that he understood that Mitch was really celebrating his father, his heritage.
And Finis would do that. He'd latch on to certain photographers and buy them in depth. And Mitch, he made a connection to before he ever met Mitch. He finally did meet him, and they hit it off right away because there was a personality connection that he could see through the work. These are also two other photographs that were in that 2013 show that, frankly, I tried to get into the museum collection. I couldn't get the support to do it. So I turned to Finis and I said, "Hey, Finis, could you help me out here and at least keep them in the area?" And he was very generous at that point. I'm also sort of poking at him saying, I'd love to have donations to the collection sometime. And he'd always kid me back saying, "Hey, I've had a good conversation with that curator down at the MFA Houston. He's starting to become my friend." And so there was always that sort of, Finis was irreverent. There was always this sort of kidding back and forth.
But he was also loyal.
Yes. Finis, you never know what will happen in the end. The bequest was a surprise on some level, not a surprise on the other level. I can't tell you how many times I asked for it. I said, this collection really belongs here, and he just put me off every single time. But he felt a deep connection to this institution, and I'm very grateful for that. And he was willing to make purchases like that, which were signs to me of his willingness to keep that connection alive.
Can we go back a little bit to just the last two?
Yep.
Finis was not necessarily just, again, intuitively. What is very interesting about this Gordon Parks picture is that Gordon Parks was the first African-American staff life photographer. He, in 1957, embarked on a 6-week journey to New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago to capture crime. Unlike his previous work, which had all been in black and white, this became the first color page, 8-page color essay called The Atmosphere of Crime to appear in Life magazine. There's no crime indicated here. However, there is the suspect of something sinister, which I think really drove Finis to get this, not just because you told him to.
Well, it drove my interest in it also. I'd lived in New York and lived in a place very much like this for a short period of time. And that experience, that sort of hallway lighting and experience and meeting people you don't know coming down the hallway is still vivid for me. It hit home. It hit an emotional connection, made an emotional connection for me.
But you see, he's beginning to look at nuance. It's not just, the face or the portrait. It's now the nuance, the gun.
And it's done in two different ways. Here, it depends on that bright color of the taxi cab.
Can I go on?
I've been put in my place.
By an Easterner.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Sorry.
William Klein, who was an American living in Paris, an artist and photographer. He was approached, Alexander Lieberman, who was the art director then of Vogue magazine, who became the editorial director of all Vogue magazines, of all Condé Nast magazines, approached Klein, an American living in Paris. And for him, Klein's pictures had an irreverence and a violence he had never experienced in anyone's work in fashion photography till then. It had strong graphic aspect of the streets, which is very important, strident color, and again, an irreverence of the frame. Klein pioneered the telephoto wide-angle lens in the street, giving us a new perspective, one caught on the sly, and and never before in fashion photography, which had been so staid and so beautifully composed. So this, again, is a very unconventional image.
Yeah, that's probably why I like it. I try to think of where am I standing in relation to the rest of the traffic. If that yellow door in the foreground is a standing cab or a moving cab, and how close am I to getting hit by the yellow cabs? Those of you who spend time in New York know it's pretty easy to sort of be dodging cabs and worrying about those kinds of things. But by putting the foreground totally out of focus and bringing the focus back to the model, that's the other side of New York you see. You can walk down the streets and all of a sudden you look up and there's a fashion shoot going on, or there's a well-known personality walking by, and these are just sort of little surprises that he's keying into. This is obviously a fashion shoot, but he's really accomplished at it.
Okay, next.
Thank you. Next, go ahead.
You can talk about Eggleston a little bit.
Eggleston. Eggleston was, I can't talk about Eggleston without talking about Elliott Porter, because Elliott Porter brought me here. Elliott Porter, as a nature photographer, nature landscape photographer, took up color with the invention of easy color, meaning Kodachrome film, and so on in the late 1930s. As soon as he took up color, he had been friends with Ansel Adams and Alfred Stieglitz and the major players in the field. As soon as he took up color, they all turned their backs on him. They said, art photography is black and white. And he persevered, and he says, I'm going to show you that you're wrong. And Porter did it by showing the sort of beauty and range of color that we tend not to notice in the world. Soil is brown, rocks are gray, the sky is blue, blah, 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 blah. And he showed that there's a lot more to it than that. What Eggleston did was something entirely different. If Porter's showing you the world with ever more sort of nuance and detail, Eggleston's showing you how, in some ways unbeknownst to you, color is shaping how you look at the world. And color is shaping how your eye moves through space and how you start to think about things. And he does it by taking up the most mundane subjects imaginable. Here, we got a tricycle sitting out in a sidewalk, something that you could probably photograph going down your own streets. But what he did was he took these ideas and by acuity to how color draws you in unexpected ways, he showed a new pathway to color that was totally different to Porter. And it was that new pathway that got picked up first by the Museum of Modern Art, John Tchaikovsky, who...
Actually not. The first person...
I'm going to get interrupted so many times. We could have a debate about this, but go ahead.
No, it's a conversation. It's a very gentle conversation. Walter Hopps, who was a very good friend of John's and who was a curator from California, had seen Eggleston first, and he was Eggleston's sort of shepherd.
And shown the work in Washington.
Right. And Walter Hopps said of Eggleston's work, his photographs carry enriched reverberations of fiction. And I think that's really what Finis saw in the work. It was also the moments of also Finis's own personal feelings. And if you go upstairs, you'll see a little bit more of the Eggleston displayed. Eggleston, who was a man of very few words, I actually was privileged to be at the Department of Photography when John Tchaikovsky did this very controversial show. And I became very friendly with Eggleston and his family and his lawyer and everybody. And we would be at John's apartment, and John would be playing piano, and Eggleston would be playing piano, and John would be playing the saxophone. And again, they didn't need to speak, they just worked together in harmony. And I think that Eggleston really didn't know what he was photographing. He photographed from the gut. It was not premeditated. It was not focused like Steichen or anybody else. It was just reflex.
But it was a reflex with a certain eye for color and how color helps organize the world.
Right.
And that's what John saw. And he saw it first in snapshots. Eggleston came with shoeboxes filled with snapshots, and it started a 5-year conversation that led to the show. And here's where she and I will diverge. I think John never understood Eggleston's work. But that's for another day. But Finis, I would say Finis was attracted to the work because on some level he had that same acuity for color, but he also liked images of things that we tend to pass by and not notice, things that are so sort of commonplace that we tend to take them for granted. And what Eggleston did was stop and say, hey, stop and look at this, what is in front of you, and spend some time with it, and you'll get something out of it. Mm-hmm. And I think Finis was interested in the same kind of thing. Uh-oh, the hand is raised. We better get going.
Uh-oh.
Okay, thank you.
2 more.
Okay.
No, let's pass by those. This is my end of the conversation. Okay, quickly.
You go ahead.
No.
Go up and look at these images upstairs, and I'll leave it at that. This one is the sun moving across the sky, and I'll let you figure out why the sun makes a right turn in the middle of the sky.
And it's also an absolutely beautiful print.
And it's the sun burning the paper.
Because the exposure is so long, and he's built the camera, it's out there. And
we'll go to this one. Do you want to go to, or do you want to go to the
I'm
next
going at the end.
Oh, the end. Oh, I'm so sorry. We've talked so long.
He talked so long.
Mea culpa. Here's Eggleston early in his career. He started out as a black and white photographer. In these days where light bulbs have changed in our lifetime so tremendously, I just love that return to the past. Sorry, I can't stop. This is there's 9 of these images upstairs. Talk about turning something mundane, kids jumping off a dock into the water, and turning it into a whole nother world.
A symphony, actually.
There we are.
Yeah.
The last 2 images that we'll show, and Diana, I'd love to have you talk about them.
This is Finis at his best. And the Tina Madotti, on July 4th of 2020, he called me and he said, I saw this in the catalog of Sotheby's. I want you to go look at it. And it's the height of COVID. My husband's ill. I could not go into the city. I had not left our house since March. And so I had a restorer, one of the best in New York, go look at it. I did not like what he did, what he saw, how he did it. The head of the department, Emily Berman, and I confirmed. She photographed it many times. We talked about it. We Zoomed, everything else. We agreed that it was absolutely beautiful. And what Finis saw in it...
Can I interrupt? I have to interrupt. I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt. I'm sitting in Texas in the middle of COVID time, and I'm not going to go to New York. There's no travel allowed out of this institution. And I've got to take her word for it. And they keep sending me all these images that are high-resolution images, and I'm trying to figure out what the heck is going on in this image. Because some people are saying, well, it's been retouched, and I'm saying, well, can you see the retouching? And they say there seems to be words in the middle of the images, and maybe somebody's written on it or something like that, and I'm trying to say, because it's an unusual, rare image that was offered. It was modestly expensive. We never talk about price in institutions. And we're trying to advise a third party who's sitting elsewhere whether to go for it or not. And we went back and forth and back and forth. Sorry,
Yes, we did.
Go ahead.
And we got it. What he loved about it was that it was the interior of a church, but to him it was totally erotic. And it was just bliss. He never saw it.
Yeah, he died before the print could be transferred from New
But
York
please
down
go
to
look at it
Texas.
upstairs.
It's a really, we put these two prints together. This is Tina Madotti, taken by Edward Weston. Remember, we started.
And one of the
early
most
on
beautiful
Weston.
prints
And-
imaginable.
And this is Weston having taught Tina Madotti how to make photographs, and her early in her career starting to figure it out. If you go upstairs and you look at it, it looks more like a graphite drawing than a photograph. But it's her experimenting and some level trying to make a photograph that it's so complex and so confusing that it almost seems like the whole thing's going to blow apart. You know, I think of Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, which is basically about energy and motion. This is about how do you create an image that just barely holds together in a way that you keep having to come back to because you're sort of puzzling through it, and there's something still so alluring by those tones. There were even we even had conversations about, is it a negative print or a positive print? Those are the kinds of questions that, and what you read in the literature was wrong.
And we did conference calls. The three of us
Yep.
were on the
Back
phone.
and forth about it. And
Many
it's-
times.
It's so sad that he didn't see it, but he loved the image from afar, and he was correct in his judgment.
You know, and again, it's that intuition. He had that intuition that he grew into.
I saw the hand raise. I think it's being waved like this now. So I think that's supposed to mean
Open
that
to
we move on to
Q&A.
questions. That's right. We move on to questions. Do we have time for questions?
Go.
Thank you. Fascinating conversation. And my question is about the intuition, kind of giving us a little more insight. I guess we talked a lot about Finis, and it was wonderful because I didn't know anything about the man. But that one, as an example, how did this kind of vision in your conversations, maybe on a more candid, conversation, would you be willing to share about how he found that and was intrigued by it? And
He found it in the catalog, and he was mesmerized by it. He was just stuck to it, and he wouldn't let it go.
There's photographic auctions of photography in New York in the spring, generally in April, and then in the fall in October. And he was buying often enough that he would get the catalog sent to him, or he'd look at them online, and he'd just sort of see if there's any images that interested him. And then he'd email me or call me up, or he'd contact Diana, and sometimes both of us, and we'd sort of talk them through.
Oh, but this one in particular was very interesting because we did get that conservator to come, and he took terrible pictures of it. I mean, it just didn't work. And yet Finis would not say no. He just wanted to pursue it and pursue it. He was just, he was fixated on it. And
Yeah, we were close to
it was
saying
the
no.
evolution of the looking that he had done over the last 12 years with John and myself that he could get to that.
Yeah, we were almost said no because neither of us could get in to see the print itself. So
And
we
that's
were
so
taking
crucial.
a chance. And we just, for me, I would throw up my arms. It's very rare that I'll buy something that I haven't seen in person. Very occasionally I'll do it. But there was enough trust between the three of us that if you go up and look at these prints, you'll see how much his eye has developed over the course of just 11 years. It's really remarkable. For me, this one, if I think of making a portrait, And again, this is the difference between looking and vision. If I think of making a portrait of my wife, for example, and at this point, Tina Madotti is Edward Weston's lover, one of his lovers.
At the moment.
He has her close her eyes, and he darkens the light so she's coming out of the darkness. And it's really about her hands up on her face and her eyes closed and the lighting and so on that makes it so beautiful. And for somebody like me, the photo nerd, who sort of luxuriates in the quality of the print, it's in terms of early photography or photography of this period of time, this decade, it is top of the top for me. I could put this up in my house in a prominent place, look at it every day, and learn something from it every single day.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. And the combination of intellect and intuition is what I'm so curious to hear.
Yeah, it's
more
unusual.
Examples of that. So
It's really unusual.
And
So-
he had really a fierce intellect. You know,
he was a very bright guy.
he would always examine things from multiple points of view.
I'll give you another example. He was an economist. He studied agricultural economics in undergrad, which struck a chord with me because my brother was an agricultural economist. And then he went to University of Chicago to get an economics PhD, one of the top schools in the country for economics. If you want to think about supply side, Milton Friedman, and so on and so forth, that's a whole nother side of my debates with Finis. But he went there, and when you go to a school at that level, whether it be Chicago or Harvard or Yale or so on, they very, very rarely will hire you straight out of graduate school. They might ask you to be an instructor for a year or two or so on. Finis, they turned to him right away, even as he was finishing, and said, "We want to hire you on a tenure track to stay here because you're that valuable to us." He stayed for a short period of time, and then he bounced around. He came back to Texas, taught at SMU for a very short period of time, went out to teach at UCLA for a while, taught at Yale for a while, eventually ended up back in Texas at Texas A&M University, in part because of he's growing up in Texas. He's got a little family ranch in Texas that he takes an interest in building up. And that's a whole nother tale that I just know the barest glimpses of, but he built up a ranch to include, by the time of his death, over 10,000 acres. It was really amazing operation. And it was not only the ranching, he became interested in cutting horses, and he raised a champion in the cutting horse competition. Those of you who don't know about cutting horses that occur, there are competitions that occur 4 times a year across the street. Many of the competitions are free. You can walk in and just take a look at what's going on and ask somebody to come and explain to you. It comes from the tradition of cutting smaller cows out of the herd to brand them. But it's now become an amateur and a professional kind of sport. And Finis, as he takes to something, takes to it fully, and took it to the top of the line and created a champion.
But not only that, on the ranch, he had his own veterinary clinic. He built the houses for his staff. He would, every Friday, be there at 4:30 in the morning to have breakfast with his staff. He was totally involved, as he was in collecting photographs.
So we thank him, and we hope you take a little bit of him along with you as you move through the rest of your week. Good luck with things tomorrow. Thank you so much for coming.
And please look at the exhibition upstairs.
Yeah.